Hello out there, this is Richard Woolley, weathertrends360 Chief Meteorologist, coming to you from the Warp 5 Weather Center here at Weather Trends headquarters. We're going to talk about the 2020 Ag Outlook. First, before we get there, let's take a quick review of some of the services we have for you. Don't forget, FarmCast subscription holders, they get the daily email report, can also come into the website and get all kinds of information with regard to what's going on in the weather and the overall outlook. By the way, for you users out there, don't forget to set your spring planting date next year. Very important to set the overall milestones for the various crops and indices that we carry on the site. Well, let's take a look at what happened in 2019. Really don't need to go over the quotes here, but basically it was wet. A lot of rainfall everywhere. As a matter of fact, one of the wettest years in the United States history. So it was quite wet, and it was quite wet almost everywhere. Again, one of our partners, Advantage Acre, they had used our information and had some great wins this year. So again, great services out here, and it was an awful wet 2019. Did we forecast it? That's the next question everybody asks. Well, we sure did. We had a pretty cold, this is for the Corn Belt, we had a fairly cool trend here in May and June. And we also had it very wet April, May, June, and again here a little bit in July. With the drying out here as we got late in the summer, that kind of saved the day as things started to dry out and got a little bit improved. But overall, temperatures were the coldest in 11 years, and it was the wettest in 30 plus years. Like I said, this is one of the wettest years on record for the United States as a whole. So let's take a look at the upcoming forecast here. Right now, right in front of us is the overall sea surface temperature anomalies across the globe. You can see generally the oceans are running a bit warmer than normal. That's indicated by all these greens and oranges and reds. That's warmer than normal conditions. Blue are colder than normal, and you'll see most of the oceans around the globe are basically running at normal, if not above normal. A few pockets of below normal here and there. But that's not really the big thing we're looking for. We want to look for certain places in the ocean that have certain temperature anomalies. So we look at this area down here. We call it La Nada today. This is where the El Nino usually is, El Nino or La Nina. Right now we call it La Nada because there's really nothing going on. It's in between, it's right around normal, it's not a whole lot of anything either way. We also have a Motokai out here, the El Nino Motokai, or that's what the Japanese have termed a kind of a westward shift to where the warm water usually is with an El Nino, out here more toward the date line. This is more impactful of where the overall jet stream coming off Asia will do its buckle in the Pacific and then come into the North America. We think overall coming up for the winter here, it's going to go up and over the blob here in the western or eastern Pacific, come down through much of the western U.S., the Rockies and the plains, and then eject out through eastern North America and out into the Atlantic Ocean. We also have a couple other notable things for the upcoming winter here. We have blocking across the northern hemisphere up in the high latitudes. We have a propensity for negative NAO in the Atlantic Ocean. And for those weather buffs out there, what's that mean? Well, that means an overall tendency to have a fairly cool winter here in January, February, and December across the continental United States. Not everywhere, but quite a lot of areas will see a fairly cold winter and fairly snowy. As a matter of fact, our friends in Minnesota are digging out from snow this morning as I speak. As we look ahead to the forecast, though, these temperature conditions in the oceans have big impacts on the overall upcoming forecast in the spring. The good news is we're looking at a warmer spring. This is the overall March to May time frame for 2020, and these oranges and reds are indicating a much warmer trend across the plains. Great news for all our farmers out there, much warmer and also much drier. Take a look at all the browns and yellows out here. That indicates overall drier conditions. Now, one thing to note here, much of this warming and drying happens in March and May. April's a little cooler, a little wetter, but overall March, May is a good time frame, and that's really going to help for an ideal spring planting season. As we go into the summer, though, this is now going into June through August. We're going to take a look at the precipitation. Temperature is not much of a big deal at this point in the year for us, but precipitation is, and we're starting to see it getting pretty dry here across the upper Midwest. This is actually versus normal conditions here, and you see it turning quite dry here across northern Iowa, southern Minnesota. Matter of fact, overall for the Corn Belt, it's the driest in 3 years. And again, southern Minnesota down into northern Iowa, maybe northwestern Illinois, overall precipitation could be 30% less than normal. So something to think about when it comes time to choosing what clones and what types of seed you're going to be planting later this year, or later actually in 2020. Again, we're talking about not a whole lot of drought in 2019, pretty much nothing. It was down around 10%, one of the lowest in decades. This year, in 2020, we expect quite a bit more drought. So again, drier conditions in 2020, something to think about in your choices. Good news is we'll see less tornadoes. A lot of tornadoes last year, less this year. Bad news, more hurricanes. 2019, we had a number of hurricanes, but they were very short-lasting hurricanes. Matter of fact, many of them were just barely a tropical storm for a few hours before they died. In 2020, we expect many more long-lived storms, bigger storms, more impactful storms. These will be a risk to Florida, up the East Coast, into the Northeast, so don't be surprised that you hear about a hurricane threatening, Long Island or coastal New England during the summer season or late fall. The other area to think about is also South Texas. Going to watch that as we get into October. The U.S. isn't the only corn growing area in the world. We do have others to keep an eye on. The Ukraine is another large area of production down here in southeastern Europe. And unfortunately, those folks are going to see a year similar to what we saw last year in 2019. So 2020 is a lot like 2019 in the Ukraine. So they're going to see much cooler, much wetter. You see a lot of wetness here in April, and again June through August, very wet. They may be able to get stuff into the ground, but you're going to have risk with spring frost, cooler conditions, and then lots of rain. So overall, wettest in 12 years, coolest in 5 years. Another area of interest to grain farmers here is in Brazil. These are the main winter or spring growing season for corn, where they grow the safrinha crop, which is a second crop of corn in Brazil. This is the one they export. Overall, the winter conditions are looking pretty dry down there throughout most of Brazil. And you can see in our chart over here, a lot of these brown bars kind of through the middle of their growing season, which is really December and January. A lot of dry weeks in there. So they're overall going to be a much drier growing season for them. So we would expect yields to be down a little bit coming out of Brazil. So lower yields coming out of Brazil due to dryness, lower yields coming out of southeastern Europe due to flooding and early spring problems, but better yields coming out of the U.S. with more favorable conditions. So overall, the U.S. might be the bright spot, and maybe by then some of the geopolitical tensions get out of the way with tariffs and so forth, and prices start to rebound next year. Let's also take a look at one other crop just for our sugar growers out there, India being a major sugar producer. Brazil is also a big producer, but they generally use all their own sugar. But India produces a lot of sugar for export. Very, very wet next year. Very similar to this year. Here's a chart, last 28 years of precipitation. You could see that this year and last year, almost exactly the same amount of precipitation. This is 2019, this is 2020. Almost the same amount, but it's the distribution and where it falls and when it falls. 2020, we're going to see the rain show up earlier, probably at the beginning of June, maybe even late May, unlike in 2019 where it didn't show up till July. And that's a big difference for the folks in India. If they don't get that rain early in the season when the monsoon begins, it can be very hot for the first couple months of the summer, and that can be detrimental to their crops. This year, very hot early, rain was late coming on. Next year, rain arrives a lot earlier, so it's a lot more favorable for the overall sugar crop. So it should be much better for 2020. If you need any help getting into your FarmCast account or would like to sign up for FarmCast, feel free to give Pam Rometta a call to the following number, 610-807-0118. She'll be happy to help you out. And we look forward to talking to you again in 2020. Have a good season.